Although Astraeos isn't complete yet, there's a ton of content that's been released so far. In this video, I'll cover the tips and tricks I've learned from my 50 hours of researching and testing Astraeos over the past few weeks. By the end of this video, you'll know everything you'll need to know to be a pro at Ark Ascended's newest map. When the map updates, I'll leave comments on my Discord server regarding changes to information from this video. The invite link to that server is in the description, and if you join the server before it reaches 500 members, you'll get extra entries into my biggest giveaway yet. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the first question you may have is where to spawn, and in my opinion, this answer is pretty simple. You should spawn on Corinthos pretty much every single time you play this map. Think about it like this. Corinthos is the first island that was released on Astraeos, so it had to be self-sustaining with the resources that the map provided. The next section of this tips and tricks video is a full resource guide, and you'll see there how many resources are most optimally farmed on Corinthos. It also is the safest area on the map by a landslide, and it has the best creature on the map, the Maeguana, so there's no downside in going here as opposed to the harder areas. One more perk I want to talk about for spawning on Corinthos is that there's a campsite at 6123 on the map, and it gives you so many metal tools. It gives you a lot of hatchets, pickaxes. It can even give you crossbows from these crates in the campsite. So I would definitely recommend going here and farming them by spawning in the west or east bottom side of the island. For what it's worth, I'd also recommend basing in Corinthos pretty much every time because, yet again, you're at the central hub of every resource on the map, so it's going to be much more convenient to live here than other places. Alright, now let's get into the full resource guide for Astraeos. First up, let's talk about metal spawns. The best metal spawn on this map is at 58.6, 16.9 in this mountain region. The metal spawns everywhere here. It also has crystal and obsidian, but the metal is absurd. The second most densely populated metal spawn on the map is around 38.3, 15.7. This is near the biggest statue on Astraeos where the bosses can be spawned. There's a lot of metal here as well, but it's just a bit more spread out than the first area, so I put it a little bit lower on my list. Either of these areas are excellent for metal. You'll never run out of metal in your base if you go farm these two spots. The other perk of these two areas, besides it being the most densely populated areas on the map for metal, is that there's not that many dangerous creatures to interfere with your farming. If you go to the Faquintos mountains, there's also a lot of metal there, but it's just not as safe to farm, and there's not as much metal, so I picked these two spots instead. Alright, next let's get into crystal spawns. Crystal spawns ridiculously commonly on both Corinthos and Therokis, but for my personal testing, the best area to farm crystal on the map is definitely at 33.1, 12.9 on Corinthos. Another nice bonus is that this area is ridiculously safe, so you don't have to worry about anything interfering with your farming, just like the metal spawns I mentioned. Obsidian has pretty similar spawn areas to metal on this map, but in my experience, Obsidian spawns most at 40.5, 15.7 in this mountain region. I'm almost certain this is the most densely populated Obsidian spawn area on the map, and there's great value in going on a trip here because there's also metal in the area, so you can farm both at the same time. There's two spots on Astraeos that I like to farm oil. The first is at 48.6, 29.0. There's two reasons that I love farming oil in this area. The first is that it's also surrounded by silica and black pearls, so you can farm those at the same time. And the second is that this area sometimes has celestial or astral mosas, so you can farm those for fantastic loot drops at the same time. I'll talk more about astral creatures later in the video, but for now, just know that farming them is a huge boost to your progression. Oil spawns very densely in this area down here in the foliage, and it's great to farm it here, but it's not the best area to farm oil on the map, in my opinion. That title goes to 65.1, 14.1. If you're looking to farm strictly for oil, this is the best area on Astraeos to do it. There's ridiculously dense oil spawns, it's close to the surface so you can get down, farm, and get out quickly, and there's much less dangerous threats in the area to worry about. If you're looking to farm silica or black pearls, go back to 47.8, 28.8 to where the first oil spawn location was. This is by far the best place to farm silica pearls and black pearls on the entire map. This area comes with the same downsides as the first oil area I mentioned. It's a dangerous spot, there's eels, there's mosas, but there's really no alternative for the pearl farming on this map like there was for the oil, so this is all I can really offer you. You have to go down and grab it, you gotta be careful. The solution to this problem is simply to bring an angler down. The angler collects an insane amount of pearls of both the silica and black pearl variety, and it's very fast so you can avoid the threats that I just mentioned. Next up, let's talk about narcotics. Narcotics are obviously really easy to make at all times, but on Astraeos, there's even easier ways to make them. As you run around the beaches on Astraeos, you may notice rotting sharks on the beach. These act extremely similarly to the Basilosaurus corpses that are on Ragnarok. They drop a healthy amount of oil, spoiled meat, and a little bit of hide as well, so they're great to farm in the early game. There's a couple of different ways to farm cementing paste on Astraeos, and all of them are very effective. The first way is to just go farm beaver dams. The best beaver dam spawn area on this map is at 4.2, 9.3. This spawns an insane amount of dams, and you can get a ton of cementing paste from farming this. The downside here is that this is really out in the corner of the map. It's far top left, so if you don't want to go out of your way too far, you could also just go farm chitin. There are other areas on the map where beaver dams spawn, but in my opinion, the beaver dam quantity in those other areas isn't enough for it to be worth farming that as opposed to chitin. My favorite cave to farm chitin in is at 29.9, 9.5 because it has a huge amount of bugs that spawn in a small area at the entrance of the cave, and it's just a little bit safer than the other areas that you can farm in caves because you can't get surrounded as easily. I also like going to the B cave at 46.1, 11.3 as going on a chitin trip there multitasks with farming polymer and honey. Speaking of polymer and honey, the best place to farm both of these on the map is the B cave at 46.1, 11.3. In this cave, you'll find a lot of creatures that you can kill for chitin, which is great for farming for cementing paste, as well as an abundance of beehives towards the back of the cave. If your intention is to farm for the honey, you want to use a pickaxe or an anki, and if your intention is to farm for the polymer, you can use a hatchet, a chainsaw, or a dodic. All of these are very effective, and it's just so much loot in the back of this cave. I personally farm the back of this cave by hand just because it's kind of inconvenient to get the dodic and the anki to reach some of these beehives that are higher up, as well as the beehives that are on the walls that are overarching above the cave, but it really comes down to preference. The last resource I'm going to talk about in this full guide is sulfur. I'll talk about element later in the video. To get sulfur, you need to go into the Wyvern trench at the bottom. There's a lot of sulfur rocks there. Obviously, strictly farming sulfur in the bottom of the Wyvern trench and trying to go out back where you came in is going to be a bad idea. That's why I recommend going through the water to get in and out of the trench if you're trying to farm sulfur. The sulfur rock spawns are right next to the water, and if you're in the water, the wyverns can't hurt you. So if you're actually in danger, just jump in the water and swim back out the way you came in. If you have a Maeguana with you that's waiting in the water, that can swim as far as you want because it doesn't have an oxygen stat, so this is a great choice for that. You can also use underwater creatures if they have a decent weight stat, but I prefer the Maeguana because having it next to you in case the wyverns get to you is a good thing to have. You can jump on the Maeguana, jump into the water, and then get out. This will keep you safe from the wyverns actually killing you, and even though the Maeguana can't glide in the wyvern trench, it's good enough to get you out of danger. Using the Maeguana or an underwater creature is also pretty much a must bring. If you bring scuba, that can work, but it's really inefficient because actually getting in there and getting out takes a while. So if you're not filling up on as much sulfur as you're going to need for a while, it's going to take a lot of time to make multiple trips. Alright, now let's talk about the Maeguana. First, let's go over how to tame it. The Maeguana tame is pretty simple, but it's a little bit harder than it was in Gen 2 on Evolved because there's no net gun. The best way to tame one is to get it in billboards and then place a roof over it like I'm showing you now. I would bring a couple of billboards. People say you only need 3, but generally it can get a bit scuffed. I usually bring 4 or 5 just to be safe. It's very easy to do, and if you don't attack the Maeguana, it's not going to jump away from you. Once you have it stuck in billboards and you've placed pillars up to ceilings that are blocking off the top, then you can knock it out in just a couple of long neck or crossbow shots. It doesn't have a high torpor, but trying to do this without trapping the Maeguana will lead to the Maeguana simply jumping away, and it will not work. Now let's talk about all the movement tech the Maeguana has, because there is a lot here. The Maeguana has an insanely high jump. It has great gliding ability that can make it go infinite speeds pretty much. It has unlimited swimming power because of it having no oxygen stat, and it can skid on the floor, which makes it incredibly fast. Here's how I recommend utilizing all of these techs to go as fast as possible. First, let's talk about the jumping. The Maeguana has 2 types of jumps, a normal jump and a charge jump. The normal jump doesn't go as high, but it comes out much faster, and the charge jump obviously gets you higher in the air, but takes a few more seconds to actually execute. If your intention is to start a glide from no momentum, I would recommend using the charge jump to get more air so you don't land back on the ground too quickly. If you're already going fast and you're skidding on the ground, that's when you want to use the short jump just to get back up into the air before you lose your momentum. Momentum is a huge thing for the Maeguana's speed. It's the fastest creature in the game if you don't lose it. To keep momentum when you're in the air when you're gliding, simply look up and down slightly as you're going through, and you'll never lose momentum because you keep getting bursts of speed. One thing I want to note here is that on Astraeos, there is certain areas on the map where you can't use the Maeguana's glide, one of those being the Wyvern Cave. It comes equipped with a parachute that's meant to counteract this, but I personally just don't use it because it's so slow. In certain applications where you're trying to descend down into a cave that's dangerous or something, you can use the parachute to just simply float over in a very controlled way over the threats, but I don't think in the Wyvern Cave on Astraeos, this is really relevant. I do like using this on Astraeos' lava cave, but I'll talk about that more later. The Maeguana's skid is another really important part of its movement kit. When you land on the ground after a glide at high speeds, you maintain your momentum and skid on the ground instead of just coming to a full stop. If you're skidding at a high speed, you can press the jump button without charging it for a short jump, which keeps all of your momentum and lets you glide back in the air again. The Maeguana also skids on the surface of water, so you can just cover oceans in super short amounts of time. The last part of the Maeguana's movement kit is that it's able to swim with no oxygen stat at a pretty high speed, so it's a pretty solid option for underwater exploration. The last thing I want to talk about for the Maeguana is how it raises creatures, because it has changed a decent bit from how the Maewing used to work. The first change is how the liquid looks from the Maeguana, and it looks extremely strange. The second change is that you can't upgrade nursing effectiveness anymore, so even though the range is bigger by default than the Maewings used to be, it's not as large as the Maewings was post-leveling. The food coming from the Maeguana isn't as efficient as it was for the Maewing either. When you upgraded nursing effectiveness on the Maewing, it actually increased the amount of food that was given to your creatures after they consumed it from a Maewing. That isn't a thing in Ascended, so you're gonna have to spend more food to raise your creatures than you did in Evolved. Moving on from the Maeguana, let's talk about some of the rarest creatures on this map and how to get them most easily. First up, let's talk about the Rhino-Ignatha. The Rhino-Ignatha spawns insanely commonly at 26.1, 19.9 in this small swamp area. I've been flying around this map for literally a week straight testing out a bunch of stuff, and every time I fly past this area, there's at least 2 to 3 Rhino-Ignathas flying around. Just in this clip alone, I fly into the swamp just to show it off, and there's 4 flying around. This is unheard of. I've definitely seen a good amount of rhinos spawn at the same time before, but I've never seen them spawn so densely together in one area. I mean, this swamp is incredibly small. You can cover the entire thing in 10 seconds on certain creatures, and you can find 4 Rhino-Ignathas in that period, so it's really cool. This area also has a good amount of Deinosuchus, but it's kind of annoying having to clear all the Rhino-Ignathas every time you want to check the levels to try to find a good level Deinosuchus, so I'd recommend going to the bigger swamp to find good level Deinosuchus. But yeah, this might be the most consistently spawning Rhino-Ignatha area on the entirety of Ark, so definitely check it out. Another creature that can be tricky to find on Astraeos is the Ovis, but I think I found the best spawn area for it, so let me show it off to you. Up in the top left of the map in the Therokis Island, you can find this strip of land here where there's a bunch of Daedons, Ankies, Argies, and other creatures, and on this area, there's a ton of Ovis that spawn. They do die pretty quickly to Daedons, so you should be careful, but if you're there and looking for them, you will find them. This area is just insanely useful for taming stuff. It's right near those beaver dams I talked about earlier, and it has Daedons, Ankies, and Ovis, which are all insanely useful creatures to know the location of. Another insanely useful creature on this map is Wyverns, and there's 2 steps to getting a Wyvern here. To get the Wyvern egg, you need to enter the Wyvern trench, or cave in this case, and grab an egg and then escape. Once you grab an egg, the Wyverns will aggro to you, so you need to be careful. There's 2 strategies to grab the egg. There's the easy way and the fun way. The Wyvern cave is right here on the map, and the best way to get into it is definitely to go over to the ocean here and dive down into it. Once you dive down, you can swim under the Wyvern cave and then swim up into where the eggs are spawning. This bypasses most of the Wyverns and lets you find the eggs you're looking for and get out safely. Some general notes are that I would always use a Maeguana regardless of which way you're going in, either glide in through the top or just swim under with a Maeguana, and either way you go in, you definitely want to exit through the water as it's extremely safe when the Wyverns are chasing you because they can't swim. Trying to go out through the top and get through all the Wyverns is just a death sentence. It is fun trying to do it, but it's not really going to work. Once you have a Wyvern egg you want to raise, there's 2 ways you can possibly raise it. The healing method is pretty simple. You get a Daedon and you consistently heal the baby back up even though it's starving to death the entire time instead of you getting Wyvern milk. The second option is to simply feed it Wyvern milk so you don't have to go on consistent meat runs to keep your Daedon healing the Wyvern. If you want to actually feed your baby, here's my tips. The most important thing to note for this process is that knocking out a Wyvern on the actual island the Wyvern spawn on is a nightmare. That's why I recommend going off to this side island over here. You don't have any Wyverns getting in your way, so it's safe to build. It's a flat area and it's close enough to the main island that you can drag Wyverns without having too much risk. In terms of what trap to use, I'd recommend using a Wyvern trap from Captain Fat Dog. This trap is pretty good from my experience. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. His video will be linked down below, or you can just pause this video and look at how the trap is built. It's not super hard to replicate. Those are quarter walls building up over the sides, and there's sloped walls on the sides there. It's nothing super crazy. If you're flying into this trap with a Wyvern, you want to fly through the bottom portion of the trap so you can actually fit through. And if you're flying on any other creature, just fly through the middle and the Wyvern will follow you and get trapped. Even if you mess up getting the Wyvern trapped once or twice, as long as you have enough stamina, there's totally enough of a window to get this thing trapped. It's very easy. Moving on from creatures, let's talk about how to get the best loot on this map in terms of blueprints, items, drops, stuff like that. First, let's talk about cave drops. Now, I don't really say this very often, but on Astraeos, you really shouldn't be farming cave drops as your main source of loot. Astral creatures are much better to kill and farm than going for cave drops in terms of loot quality, and OSDs are better in quality and quantity, so there's no reason to ever go for cave drops. While they are easier to get than, for example, killing astral creatures or OSDs, they're just not good enough to even waste the time doing it. Speaking of astral creatures, let's talk about them next. Astral creatures are absurdly broken in the current meta. The quality of the loot that these astral creatures drop is ridiculously high, and pretty much every astral creature you kill will give you at least one useful item, something like a piece of flak or a weapon, so they're always worth killing if you see them. I've noticed the astral creatures drop a lot less blueprints and more just raw loot drops, but even in that case, the items are so good that it's always a good idea. That being said, even though the astral creatures are really good, the OSDs are still king for farming loot. Before I get into the OSD talk, let's talk about a few more things about astral creatures first. Astral creatures act very similarly to how alpha creatures act, but they have a few differences. One is obviously that they drop way better items than normal alpha creatures. Two is that there's a wider variety of astral creatures that can spawn. For example, I've seen astral Argies a few times, and that's just not a thing that there's an alpha version of. They also have miniature versions of themselves with them in a pack pretty much all the time. For example, if you find an astral Moza, you're pretty likely going to find normal Mozas with that astral Moza. The astral creatures have the same spawn instances as their normal counterparts, so for example, astral raptors can only spawn in areas that normal raptors have a chance of spawning in. One last thing I want to cover before I move on is that the astral creatures do scale in terms of loot quality based on the creature you kill. If you kill an astral Rex, it's most of the time going to give you better stuff than an astral raptor would if you killed that, but it is still worth farming every astral creature you find because all of them drop really good stuff. So if you see a creature glowing blue and you know you can kill it, definitely do so. One more thing I want to discuss before I move on to the OSDs is element veins. Element veins are the best way to farm element on this map. The strategy for farming element veins on Astraeos is the exact same as it was on Extinction except for one thing. Instead of riding a Maeguana on this map because Maeguanas aren't here, simply ride on the back of a Karka and have a couple of other Karkas that are tamed defending the other sides of the vein that you're not on, and it will be a breeze to defend it. To determine an element vein's difficulty, simply go to the main node and check how much HP it is. If it's on 10,000 HP, it's easy, 25,000 is medium, and 50,000 is a hard node. These are comparable to a blue, yellow, and red OSD respectively. Once you complete a vein, all you have to do to farm it effectively is to farm the outer nodes first before farming the center, because if you farm the center first, it will break all the outer nodes and you won't get the element from those. You can't tame a mantis yet on Astraeos, but once you're able to, or once you're able to transfer it over, definitely use the mantis to farm the veins. For now, a pickaxe works and Anki can do the job. The mantis is the best though once it's available. From my personal experience, element veins and OSDs have become easier to do on Therokis, aka Astraeos, than they are on Extinction, because the rocky terrain on Therokis makes it so much easier to compartmentalize these creatures that are attacking your OSD or element vein. Just a side note before I move on to OSDs, the creatures that are supposed to be corrupted on Astraeos are called lightning creatures. They basically have this yellow tint to them. They look exactly the same, just yellow instead of purple for this map. They give you corrupted nodules as well, which can act as organic polymer. It's just not as efficient as the insanely OP bee cave from earlier. Alright, now let's get into OSDs. OSDs work almost identically in terms of the strategy to defend them and how they spawn on the map. They drop down from the sky and you have to defend them to get loot drops, and there's higher waves you can go to past 5, but doing 5 will complete it and give you at least some rewards. There's only a few key differences between the OSDs on Astraeos and Extinction, and I've already mentioned a couple, like it being a little bit easier due to the easier terrain. The Astraeos OSDs have very similar drop tables to the Extinction ones. The only difference that I've seen personally is that they give less weapon traits than the Extinction ones do, which is kind of a bummer because that's a really cool mechanic. In terms of their spawns, I've only noticed the red and the yellow OSD spawning. I've not seen any blue or purple, which is kind of a bummer. Nakatis said himself that they all spawn, but from my experience, you can only get the lowest and highest tiers of these OSDs by spawning them in manually. This also applies to the element veins on the lowest tier. Obviously, there is no legendary element vein ever, but yeah, the 10k HP, aka the easiest element vein, also doesn't spawn on Therokis, which is something that I forgot to mention in the previous section. The easiest strategy for OSD defense is to have dino leashes with the Karkas attached to it. The Karkas won't go out of the AoE of the OSD, so it will actually be effective in defending it the entire time, and you'll be on the back of a Karka yourself, helping out kill all the creatures that slip through the cracks. I'm using Extinction footage to explain the element veins and the OSDs, but the concept is the exact same on both maps. One more thing I should note is that placing Velociraptors that are on turret mode around the actual thing you're defending, for example the OSD itself or the main element vein, is a great way to get some extra DPS in your defense. The last world event that can happen on Therokis is the Roaming King Titan. Yes, they brought this back a second time, and it is still as broken as the first time. The first thing I want to talk about for the Roaming King Titan is that there's 3 different difficulties that it can spawn at. It can spawn in Gamma, Beta, or Alpha, and it's completely random which difficulty is chosen. Killing the Roaming King Titan will give you cosmetics as well as a world buff. If you kill the Gamma version, you get a 3-hour world buff. If you kill the Beta version, you get a 12-hour world buff. And if you kill the Alpha version, you get a 36-hour world buff. And all of these world buffs act in real life time. So if you killed on Alpha, you'll get the buff for 1.5 real life days. Even though the spawns on single player are absolutely broken, if you do manage to find one, just note that disconnecting will pause the timer for this, but if you're on official servers, unofficial servers, anything that runs around the clock, the timer will continue to tick even if you log off. Here's the list of every single world buff that the King Titan can randomly give you. Harvesting health increase, egg hatching increase, taming speed increase, experience gain increase, crop growth increase, resource regen increase, wild dino damage decrease, tamed dino damage increase, stamina drain decrease, health regen increase, survivor boon which decreases food and water drain, Baby Boom, which not only increases mature speed, but also the amount of imprint gained, as well as lowering the imprint timers for your creatures, and a mating interval decrease. These definitely do vary in terms of how good they are, but they're all pretty good, so if you actually do run into a roaming King Titan and want to kill it, it may be worth your time. If you're trying to kill the King Titan, there's two methods I would recommend. Either you want to use Dreadnoughtus, which are pretty simple, they just spawn on Therokis in pretty common areas, and there's Gigas that also spawn across the map in a couple of areas. You can see it on screen now. These are the two best options for killing the roaming King Titan by a pretty wide margin. Alright, now let's get into the 6 artifact caves that this map has. The first cave I'll talk about is at 37.4 22.5, which hosts the artifact of the Massive, which is used as part of the Medusa boss spawn. This cave is honestly one of the trickier ones on the map, but it's pretty easy once you have an idea of what you're doing. This cave has a couple of buttons in it which basically act as a puzzle. In the first room, there's one button you can press which opens this door, and then you have access to the rest of the cave. Simply go through this room, go around to the left and through here, and then there's another big room with 3 more buttons you need to press in a certain sequence. The buttons are conveniently labeled button 1, button 2, and button 3, and if you press them in order of 1, 2, and 3, it'll open up one more hatch into an underwater section, and if you swim through this section, you get to the artifact. The biggest challenge of this cave is that it has a really narrow passageway a couple of times, so bringing any creature in can be tough. I think doing this cave on foot is actually sometimes the best choice. If you have strong armor and a good pump shotgun, you're able to dispose of the weak creatures in this cave pretty easily and get through it. There's not that many creatures that spawn, so you're not going to get overwhelmed if you take it carefully. The underwater section at the end can be tricky because of the amount of piranhas that spawn, but there's no eels or jellyfish, so you won't get stunned. Simply having flippers on you will make you outswim all the piranhas, get to the artifacts, and get out pretty easily. You can bring in pretty skinny creatures like raptors or something to this cave if you really want to use a creature, but it doesn't really require it because this cave just doesn't have that many creature spawns in it. The cave at 29.9 9.5 hosts the artifact of the Hunter, and it may be the most straightforward cave in the entirety of Ark. All it is a couple of jumps that you can easily make on a Thyla, and at the end there's 2 cave minotaurs protecting the artifact. That is all. It is super easy to get through this cave, just jump over the gaps. It's pretty easy to not mess it up when you're using a Baryonyx or a Thyla, and avoid or kill the last 2 minotaurs to get the artifact. The last artifact you need for the Medusa boss fight is the artifact of the Clever, which can be found in the cave located at 24.5 23.9 underwater. This cave is also ridiculously straightforward. If you bring a Basilosaurus down here, nothing can kill you, and you can simply swim through it, go down further, and find the artifact. There's a lot of Megalodons in this cave, as well as a ton of eels, so as long as you have something that's stun immune, for example a Basilo, an Archelon, or a Tuzo, this cave is one of the easiest in all of Ark. To be fair, I don't know if an Archelon could actually kill all the Megalodons that are down here, but I use that as an example of a stun immune creature. I would really recommend using a Basilo or a Tuzo. Now that all the artifact caves are talked about for the Medusa boss fight, let's talk about all the artifact caves for the Ogre boss fight, which is called Thodes the Widowmaker. Just as a fair warning, these caves are harder than the caves for the Medusa boss fight, but the Ogre boss is far easier than Medusa, so let's get into it. The artifact of the Brute can be found in the underwater cave at 48.6 49.8. This cave is huge and has horrible lighting bugs, but it's not too bad. There's basically no hostile creatures inside of here. It's just a massive cave with a couple of air pockets in the middle, so you can basically just swim through this with zero worries at all. That being said, actually getting the artifact can be a bit tricky. Once you make it to the back of the cave, look for this temple-like structure and go inside. This final room is a puzzle room, and you simply have to press one of the 8 buttons to open up the final door, which gives you the artifact. That being said, for players who don't see these 8 puzzle buttons right now on your screen, simply relog. This is a single player glitch, and if you host a non-dedicated server or just relog a single player server, you'll then be able to see the 8 buttons that I'm showing you now. The button you need to press to finish the cave is the second one on the left. Once you press this button, the wall will open and you have the artifact of the Brute. The second to last artifact cave is at 21.8 43.3. This is another puzzle cave, but this one doesn't have any creatures inside, so it's much easier once you actually know where you're going. To actually get through this cave, you need to go on the path that I'm flying through right now. Until you find this pool under you. If you drop down onto this pool and climb over this rock that's blocking an entrance, you can easily find the artifact through this path. Once you find the artifact, simply retrace your steps back and grapple back up through the hole. It's much easier to get out of this cave if you just simply grapple up through the same place you came down, so definitely bring a grappling hook with you. It's really easy to get lost in this cave. Even I got lost when I was going back through it because I wasn't fully paying attention, so yeah, definitely have the grappling hook and be attentive of where you're turning. The artifact of the Devourer is really just not too bad to get. Its only challenge is getting lost in the cave, so just follow this guide and you'll be fine. The last cave that has an artifact in it is at 67.4, 62.9, and it contains the artifact of the pack. This cave is found on the new Therokis Island, and it's the lava cave for Astraeos. This cave is pretty easy to navigate through, but there are a lot of dangerous threats inside. There's high-level Rexes, Theres, Pyromans, and much more, so you need to be careful. There's a couple of ways that you can get through this cave pretty easily. The best way is definitely to just parachute through and use grappling hooks, or just use the Maeguana's parachute feature to fly through the entire thing unharmed. That being said, if you use this method, getting out of the cave is pretty difficult. You're either going to need a ton of grappling hooks or just be really good at the Maeguana to avoid everything that's trying to attack you. Either way does work, and it's still what I recommend, but you're going to have to be prepared for this. With all the other tips out of the way, there's just 2 left, one for each boss fight. Let's start with the Ogre. The Ogre is insanely easy. It has a lot of HP, sure, but it doesn't do that much damage, and it doesn't have a great AoE on its attack, so if you just bring any powerful creature, it will dominate this boss. Obviously in the game currently, the Deinosuchus is the best statistical creature for boss fights, but you can bring something like an army of Rexes and it'll work just fine. The Ogre is what I actually recommend farming in terms of boss fights for Element. If you're not going to do Element Veins regularly, just farm the Ogre boss. It's extremely easy to get the 3 artifacts pretty regularly and just fight it on Gamma on repeat. The Gamma version is a complete joke and it gives a ton of Element, so even though it's not as efficient as Element Veins, it's definitely solid. The last boss is the Medusa boss, and this one is way more difficult. The Medusa boss has insane health pools similar to the Ogre, but it does a crazy amount of damage, more than the Alpha Broodmother, and it spawns many creatures including the Uranio, Titanoboa, and Bat at high frequencies. Your best bet for this boss fight, in my opinion, is bringing the Megatherium. The Megatherium is great because it kills the spiders and the snakes and gets buffs off them, and then it kills the bats in the air as well because they're pretty tall creatures. If you bring something like a Deinosuchus, for example, even though the stats are better, it doesn't get any necessary buff from killing these smaller creatures, and then you also can't kill the bats with the Deinosuchus because they're too short. Trying to get Uranus off while you're getting attacked by bats trying to give you rabies is definitely inconvenient, so I definitely recommend bringing the Megatherium over the Deinosuchus for this fight. If you're looking for a boss fight to farm for Element, definitely pick the Ogre. The Medusa fight is way harder than the Ogre, there's a lot more thrown at you, and you can definitely lose even if you have strong creatures because you could die off the back of your creature. There's no reason to fight this boss if you're trying to farm it at all. Just bring a Uranus, Courage Roar your really overpowered Deinosuchus or Rex army, and farm the Ogre to your heart's content. Whenever Nakatis finishes Astraeos fully, I'm going to revisit this topic and do a full ultimate guide on Ark Astraeos, but until then, this is all I really have for you. The map is not complete yet, but this is the most useful stuff that I could think of so far. If you enjoy my ultimate map guides, leave me a comment down below on which map you want me to do next. I'm considering doing a full YouTube series where I cover every single map in detail, going through every tip and trick I know on all of them, so if you'd be interested in that, let me know down below. While you're down there, consider liking and subscribing to help out the channel, and check out my video on screen now where I rank Ark Astraeos' best creatures so far. Peace!